This podcast is brought to you by the GRC Insights Division. I'm Mujtaba, a sophomore at Northwestern University.
I'm Vivian, also a sophomore at Northwestern University.
And I'm Jason, a freshman at Northwestern University. To begin this podcast, I'd like to begin with an extremely interesting story that turned my school into a spiral at the beginning of COVID-19. So my principal, Mr. Timmerman, he was about to leave AISG, which was my school in China, for another job in Qatar at another international school in Qatar. So then in around January, he had to fly to Qatar for an interview, right? Because the other school wanted to see if he was the most qualified candidate for the presidency. So what happened was that when he was returning from that interview, instead of going back to Guangzhou, his flight was redirected to Wuhan. And the first day that it became news that the pandemic would reach like the entire China. At that time, it wasn't like a worldwide pandemic, but it was news that it was a very serious thing. And basically that was the day when China started to really mandate us to do a lot of things like wear a mask, socially distance, and all of that. So it was an extremely interesting experience. And my principal personally told me that he was extremely freaked out by the entire accident. And it was just very terrifying for him to be in the center of this pandemic at the very beginning that has really, been permeated throughout our lives. Yeah.
That's a really interesting experience, Jason. So experiences like these allow us to discuss unique perspectives about COVID and how it's affected the lives of people very differently, depending on many factors, where they live, their age, their ethnicities, among other things. And so the focus of this podcast is really going to be a comparative analysis of different people's perspectives and experiences during COVID. And the three of us, given that we're students, have been able to interact with many of our peers about their global experiences. They live abroad. Many of them live abroad, so we've been able to discuss with them about unique experiences they've had and their perspectives reflecting back on what has happened in the past year.
So I personally live in California. I've stayed home this entire fall quarter for because of COVID. And basically, I haven't gone outside for the entire time, basically, except maybe a few times, very briefly. I made sure to wear my mask and I was very careful about social distancing. And basically, everywhere kind of like requires you to wear a mask or like it's closed. Like right now, I'm on vacation in Newport Beach with my family and nothing is open. And yeah, like they don't even have any like water fountains open. So we have to like boil our own water.
Yeah, I'm from Ohio actually, so a lot of my experiences have been pretty similar given that we're both in the US. Ohio's pretty bad in terms of COVID currently. And so like a lot of the things that I've been able to do, let's say like throughout most of 2019, like dining in at restaurants, hanging out with large groups of people are no longer possible for me. And they still are not as the pandemic continues. So it's just something that we're seeing unfolding. We're not necessarily seeing it getting better as we see positive rises in cases and problems with hospital capacity, among other things. We see those pop up from time to time. So a lot of the problems in the US seem to be pretty consistent among many of the states. I know on the East Coast, though, it's a little bit comparatively better compared to many of the other states, like the Midwest and West Coast and the South. But yeah, that's been my experience from Ohio.
So my experience has been quite different from that of Mujtaba and Vivian for the past 8 months or so, but quite similar from a period in January 2020 to around April 2020. So during that time, well, I guess the regulations were extremely strict here in China, here in Guangzhou, China. So we were extremely discouraged to go outside. Like they told us, just stay at your houses, in your apartments, and just don't go outside. And basically what we did was we ordered stuff to our house every day, and we didn't even have to go grocery shopping because the distribution system here in China is pretty sophisticated. So we basically just order online and they delivered stuff to our houses. And I swear there was at one point in which I stayed in my house for a full like 60 days without leaving it. Like that was how serious the government made it
Wow.
at the beginning of the pandemic. Yeah.
Wow.
So I guess that kind of contributed to why the pandemic, the situation with the pandemic was significantly ameliorated in my city by around April, in which there were like one or two cases in the entire city with around 30 million people. So after April, they started relaxing on these restrictions and telling us that, yes, you can go out, but you got to wear a mask. And if you don't wear a mask, you're not allowed in a lot of places. Like even now in like 2021, in which there has been like 0 cases in the past 7 months or so, they're telling us you have to wear a mask or else you're not going to be allowed into the mall, nor a lot of gyms, nor a lot of public places. Of course, once you're in there though, like they don't really care that much anymore because just like the risk of not wearing a mask here right now is significantly smaller than it was around 7 months ago, around 7 to 8 months ago, because there just haven't been like many cases so far. So basically, my life has quite reverted back to normal, except the bad thing about all of this is that a lot of my friends tried to escape China at the beginning of the pandemic for countries like the US and the Korea, hoping that they would have more freedom because, China was terrible at that time. And there were like, thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases at that time. So they fled our city for other places. And now they're basically trapped in those other places where the COVID situation is worse. And I'm not able to see them for an extremely long time. So I'm basically confined to Zoom meetings with all my friends. And there are only 5 or 6 people left in the city that I'm in right now that I talk to, because I've always gone to an international school with a lot of international students. And those people have all left my city. And that's quite sad. If they had stayed here, I think they would have had more freedom, I'd say, for the past 8 months or so. Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah, no, it's good at least that you're starting to see some sense of normalcy again in places like the U.S. where we seem to be far from it. So fingers crossed things go well in the next few months in terms of vaccines and whatnot to kind of make the situation a little bit better.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
And I think we've noticed kind of a tiny bit of return to normalcy and other places as well. One of my interviewees from Canada was explained to me that British Columbia, they have, he told me that they have COVID mostly under control, where consumers can dine in at restaurants and most people on the streets would wear masks still. And so that seems like, dining in at least seems like a little better than how the U.S. is going right now in many places. Ontario, on the other hand, he told me has a really fast growth rate of COVID cases, and it was put into a state of emergency where most of the stores were shut down completely. And so there, I guess we can draw similarities to the U.S., where I guess the COVID situation itself is quite bad, but the total cases obviously are much less than the U.S. has in Canada. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I remember I believe it was a few months after the shutdown, something places started opening up in the US again. And then things kind of started getting back to normal, even though cases haven't exactly gone down enough. But yeah, as you see right now, since the fall, cases have been going up again. So how do you think the way countries handle this kind of affects conditions right now?
So I kind of talked about this during my little anecdote about my experiences in Guangzhou, China already. So here in China, at least at the very beginning of the pandemic, the government, well, not the very beginning, but once it became news that the coronavirus would be rife and widespread across the entire country, the government handled it in a very swift manner. And that means that, as I said, I was basically in my own house for like 60 days or so because they strongly discouraged anyone to be on the streets. And once I was out, like the whole city was basically a ghost town. And you must know our city has 30 million inhabitants. So it's like an extremely densely populated city. And when you went on the streets in the city center, it was a ghost town. And that's just how serious the government took it. So I guess, in my opinion, that kind of contributed to the kind of fast recovery from COVID, relatively fast recovery from COVID that my city has experienced.
Yeah, definitely. Like even right now, even though cases are going up here in the US, I noticed as I was driving down to LA with my family like the other day or so, like there were still like a bunch of cars on the highway. And as many people from California know, like LA traffic is really bad. But yeah, there were still cars. The traffic wasn't that bad though. And even here, I'm currently at um a resort-ish kind of like place. And like we noticed there are still people here like on vacation kind of, even though we're all staying in.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm actually currently based in around Chicago, and I've heard a lot of stories about here specifically with people kind of going out and not wearing masks. So even though like formally, like there are lots of like mask policies in place and stuff, it seems like a lot of people here just aren't listening, are not willing to, and I think that's a lot of the reason why the situation is not improving or not even on its way to improving yet. Um, and so I think that like for the U.S. Specifically, we can like push out policies, but the responsibility is also on the people to kind of listen to those things. Wear a mask, be responsible. Um, if you have to go out, and if you don't have to go out, just stay in. And I think a lot of people are not understanding that at the moment, and so I think there's a little bit of a change of mindset that needs to be in place before the situation can realistically start improving. And hopefully, once that change of mindset is in place, um, we can kind of see the U.S. on its way um, to the condition of places like Taiwan and New Zealand that are doing really really well right now in terms of COVID.
Yeah, definitely. I remember like right after the stay-at-home order started, people like started actually protesting like about it, and like people organized protests in like basically every big city for like anti-quarantine protests. And I know that there are also anti-mask protests, so a lot of my classmates were posting stuff on like social media like Instagram about how important it is to wear a mask. So definitely.
Yeah, definitely. I've actually, in the past few days, I talked to a friend of mine in Virginia, and basically, she told me about how in the US, like, I mean, it depends on the government structure, right? And like the regulations the government can or cannot make. So basically, she told me that in the US, if it's public property, they cannot really mandate that you wear a mask. That's what she said to me. I'm not really sure if it's true as an outsider in this conversation about COVID in the US, but that's just what she told me. She's like, if you're in a public place, like for example, on the metro, the government technically cannot mandate that you have to wear a mask. So yeah, that's just an interesting point that I wanted to know.
I remember soon after I got sent home due to this pandemic, I actually interviewed a professor at Kellogg about whether what the most effective method for the government was. And yeah, the professor basically said a government, like not government shutdown, but like basically having everyone stay at home was the most effective way to help like going back to normalcy, because if people didn't stay at home, they would get sick, and then there would be tons of sick people out there, and people naturally wouldn't want to go out anyway because they're afraid of getting sick, and like they wouldn't really want to go to work either. So either way, people will stay home eventually. So yeah, essentially getting everything back to normal would require I guess just like sucking up the big losses at first.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. That's essentially, I believe, what the Chinese government kind of did at the beginning of the pandemic in around the beginning of 2020. But I guess like the government structure is kind of different, I would say. You know, like in the US, I don't know, do the people actually listen to the government that much? And like how much power does the government hold over the people? And like how much power do they have to make regulations that are against the interests of some people? I don't know what that is. You guys can
Yeah,
perhaps give me some insight into that.
no, yeah, that's exactly why I was discussing that there needs to be like a significant and kind of large scale change in mindset for people that don't like think already that COVID is an actual problem. It's kind of disheartening, honestly, to see people not understand the implications of COVID, even if it doesn't have like completely direct health related implications on them, which it does. I mean, like COVID will give you health problems. You may end up being asymptomatic, but there are lots of people out there that are of old age with underlying health conditions where COVID is like a true scare for them. It's a life threatening thing. And so I think there needs to be some sort of realization that, your actions are not, solely for yourself. It's for some sense of greater good. Um, and while we're still on the topic of kind of how different countries handled it, I was talking with one of my interviewees from New Zealand, actually. And based on what he said, based on what I understand, New Zealand went through like a really early lockdown, kind of like what you were saying, Jason. Um, and I mean, they're in a great state right now in regards to COVID, and they're really handling it well. What my friend told me was that most of his other New Zealand-based friends are all doing, internships and research in New Zealand all over the place. Um, and he's pretty grateful for how New Zealand has handled the situation because he's able to catch up with a lot of his old friends. Um, and a lot of his old friends that also studied abroad like he did, like in the UK or the US, for example, are also now back in New Zealand. But he's also, understandably very sad that the US hasn't handled it how it should have, in his opinion. Which I also share that opinion that the U.S. has not handled this how it should have. Um, so he's really kind of disheartened that he's not able to see his Northwestern friends, given that the college experience in America is so unique and diverse. Um, and so yeah, I actually have an interesting story about him. So because of the pandemic, he's actually taken it upon himself to start a business. Um,
Oh,
and
really?
yeah, yeah. So you know how like kind of most schools went over to Zoom and virtual other forms of virtual learning, like Google Meet, Zoom, all of that stuff. So he decided that it was a great opportunity to get himself in the online learning, you know, business, online learning industry, because it's still in its like really early stages. We wouldn't have ever seen this kind of growth in like the online learning industry had it not been for this pandemic kind of forcing the world to adapt to it. So he actually, he used the opportunity to enter a currently very lucrative market, it seems, for online education, the online education sector. And he feels really fortunate because the pandemic has given him that opportunity, that platform to expand his interest and get him involved in this sector. But being in New Zealand hasn't really affected his old lifestyle that much currently, because it's all good now there. You know, people are able to do what they need to do what they want to do. It's very much different from how other countries handled it, and the effects that of how other countries have handled it into the current state that those countries are in.
I think one big thing that contributes to the reason why a lot of people here in the US don't really believe that COVID is something serious, or that like they shouldn't wear masks, is because of the amount of misinformation on the media. Like these days you can find tons of like really crazy, obviously like untrue things on the media. So some people see that and they choose to believe that over act like verified sources. So yeah, there's that, and also the fact that the U.S. was founded on principles of freedom and just like not having the government control them. But in situations like this, I do believe that the government like does need to like use some power to get people to do things like so basically for the good of everyone.
Yeah, I agree, and I think what you were saying about kind of people's reluctance to follow through with kind of uh, limiting themselves in terms of the activities they do during a pandemic. I think that that also falls on the people. They need to realize that thinking that way is like a really short-term way of thinking. Like if you can't accept that you need to kind of do less things now to be able to do normal things later, you're going to be stuck in the same position for a long time. And that's not good for anyone, especially like I was saying before with people that are in life-threatening situations because of COVID.
Yeah, there's definitely a trade-off there. And I'd say that from my experience in China here, there's a lot of people who think the same way as some of the US people do think. Like, that wearing masks, it's like redundant. It's not useful. Like at the beginning of the pandemic, at least, people were like, why should we stay home? Why? But like the difference, in my opinion, is that the government has much more authority in China than the U.S. government has in the U.S. So like most people, when they hear the government say something, they just really listen to it. Like they listen to it, they follow the rules, and even though they might disagree, they still follow the rules, and that's really what it is. It's not like their mindsets are like for the greater good and like trying to help the entire public recover from the situation. That's not really it. But like when the government says something, people usually just do it because, in my opinion, most people tend to trust the government on health measures, which I'm not sure if it's a good idea or not. But in terms of COVID, it was, I believe, a good idea at the beginning of 2020. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting because as I said before, there are a lot of like anti-mask and
Yeah.
anti-quarantine protests and all.
Definitely. Even in China, like they're not protesting, but like a lot of people think that way, especially like, in different sectors of the city. For example, those people who lived in the 1970s when China was still like extremely, extremely poor and all that. They're like, it's just a virus. Like it can only kill like what, less than 1% of its people. Like why does it matter? There are people with different mindsets, but overall, they still know to listen to the government. And that's just kind of ingrained in the mindset of, I guess, most Chinese inhabitants in our city. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the US government does have emergency powers to use in cases like this, but even then, like a lot of people would still like go out and protest or that wouldn't listen.
Yeah. I think that's probably what would happen if like things like that were exercised more than they already are right now. Um, Jason, you mentioned that you had some friends that you discussed with that were from other countries. How have they responded to this, and what were their experiences like?
Well, they're right now showing quite a bit of regret for leaving China at the beginning of the pandemic. So, for example, I have a friend called Gabriel. His Korean name is Jongmin, and he's currently in Seoul, but he's been living in Guangzhou, my city in China, for the past 4 years or so until he moved to Seoul at the beginning of the pandemic to supposedly escape COVID and to live kind of a freer life before China was shut down and all that, and basically kind of blocked its borders off for all countries. So he's just regretting it a lot because if he had stayed in Guangzhou right now, he would be able to go to the gym. He would be able to, go to the mall. He would be able to kind of hang out with us. And he's even going to university in Hong Kong. There's a university called the University of Hong Kong, and he's going there. So if he was here in China instead, he would be able to meet a lot of his friends in his new university as well, as opposed to be in Korea. There, he basically has to stay home kind of 24/7, and they can't gather in groups of more than like 2 or 3 people as well right now. So his experience is, I guess, one of regret. He even missed our graduation ceremony because he left early. So that was just really sad for him. And yeah, like I really wish he was here, but he's not. And I don't think I'll see him for a long time given the current deteriorating situation of the coronavirus in Korea.
And we're seeing these deteriorating situations in a lot of places. But something that seems a little bit hopeful, at least, is the recent news on vaccines and whatnot. In the US, we've actually started rolling out vaccines. On the other side of that coin, there are people, lots of people actually, that are anti-vaccination, completely against getting the vaccine when it's available to them, which I wanted to know, do you guys have any perspectives on that?
I actually wrote a brief, like for the Daily Northwestern, which I also write for, about like the vaccines. And I know a lot of people have doubts about the vaccines just because of like the speed at which it was developed. But according to like what the professors said, the vaccine is still FDA approved and still went through all those checks. So like I know a lot of people are like hesitant about it, but it should be safe.
Yeah, so my perspective has been kind of different, and also the people around me's perspectives have been different. So, like for the Chinese students going to Northwestern, um, most people aren't going to go to Northwestern in January. Like they don't want to go to Northwestern in January because like the U.S. is pretty much in a worse situation than China right now, so they're not going. And for most people, they want to kind of wait until the vaccine is used more commonly across the country to see if there are negative effects. Because in China, if we don't take the vaccine, it's not like very significant whether or not we have the vaccine injected into us, because there are basically not that many cases here, like at least where I live. So we're waiting to see the side effects of the vaccine and whether or not it's truly reliable until we make a decision about that. That's like the general consensus amongst us. Yeah.
No, I've actually interviewed a couple of people that have gotten vaccinated already. So I know there's a lot of discussion these days as vaccine rollout has started about kind of the side effects of vaccines and whatnot. I've heard from these two sources that there are side effects, but they're they would consider it pretty similar to the flu vaccine, in that there's possibility of getting a few side effects, maybe some more side effects than the flu vaccine. But all in all, it's been, they would say, a positive experience in terms of getting vaccinated in general with the coronavirus vaccine. Now it's in doses, so I believe they still have to get their second doses, but that was their experience based on the first dose of the vaccination that they received.
Yeah, about the side effects, like that's definitely understandable why these students like still want to see the side effects, because we still don't know how like what the vaccine could possibly do to maybe people with like autoimmune disorders, or like children, or like pregnant women and all that.
And people with allergies. I've seen a couple of news articles about harsh side effects from people with allergies in response to one of the COVID vaccines.
Yeah, but either way, I don't think at least the US likely won't be able to like mandate everyone to like get vaccinated. Even though I think based on the brief that I wrote, the Constitution does allow like local and like state governments to possibly mandate it, but just not national.
Yeah, and even if the possibility is there, it seems very unlikely that a lot of places, given regional politics, would be even willing, even to talk about being willing to do something such as mandating a vaccination. Now, aside from vaccinations, Also, there's also big talk on testing and testing protocols and different kinds of tests. Personally, um, as a student, I have to get tested, which is mandated by the university, and so I think that's been a very helpful thing, um, not only for myself, just to know that I have a little bit of peace of mind, um, but also for the university, definitely in terms of contact tracing, to kind of, uh, you know, alleviate any of the consequences of one person getting COVID, because they can contact trace really well if they have a record of everything. And so I think that's been a really positive experience in terms of testing.
Yeah, definitely. I was reading, well, since I served as one of the assistant campus editors for the Daily last quarter. I know I've read about a bunch of articles about like testing around campus at least, and we have a bunch of testing centers around, and like people have to go around, like go to them really often to get tested and all that. It's become kind of like normal routine for students on campus.
Yeah, and my experience for testing, I guess, is only um, in terms of this current quarter. But yeah, that sounds pretty consistent with what I've heard from my peers that were on campus last quarter. Um, and so something else I've heard from my peers at other universities, given that they were all sent home, for break and whatnot, uh, were lots of talk around exit tests, meaning that as they were leaving university, they wanted to have the peace of mind that they weren't bringing COVID homes to their families and loved ones. Um, uh, it's surprisingly, I'm not sure really how many universities mandate something like that and how well they can control it, especially with students not living exactly on campus, whether they even afforded the ability to test and have the peace of mind that they're not bringing COVID home to their loved ones.
Yeah, I think yeah, from what I've heard, I know some people like yeah, what even like right after we were like right when we were sent home because of COVID, a lot of students were afraid of giving their parents COVID. So they when they went home, they made sure to like be careful and like try to socially distance themselves from like their family members as much as possible.
Yeah, definitely. So are you both returning to campus in a couple of days? Or
I'm staying home for the winter quarter, but I
mm,
believe most people I know who were planning on returning to campus are required to come like I think a week earlier, but like yeah, they've already come like back mostly like by now.
Yeah, I'm near campus, and the wellness period has actually already started. And I think the first day that students are in Evanston, at least, they're required to be tested, from my understanding of it. So I've been tested, and yeah, and I will have to get another test as soon as the results from this one come in, I believe. Um, yeah, and something that I kind of noticed also during this time has been the sociological implications in their relation to COVID. And so we were discussing kind of students that might not have access to exit tests and testing in general, if they're not living on university housing, for example, at different universities. And I was kind of wondering myself, like, what would it look like for students from many diverse backgrounds? How would it play out differently if they were to bring COVID home to their families? Um, I've read an article speaking of low income households and how it can kind of ravage a household if the main income source in the family had gotten COVID. Um, the much of the work um, might not be cut out for remote work. So it can really devastate many households depending on uh, kind of their socioeconomic situations. And this is also a product of we can see this like kind of inequity, not only in how COVID affects them, but also as a product of healthcare, and not equal access to healthcare amongst different people of different backgrounds. Um, in terms of region, ethnicity, many things.
Yeah, definitely. I actually have interviewed a couple of researchers for articles I wrote for the Daily about like these kinds of studies. For example, one of them was about how this pandemic has just exacerbated like food insecurity, for example, because schools are closed down. So like children who would have been on free lunch, like their parents have to like make them lunch at home. And just the overall income gaps of like as well, because usually higher paying jobs are able to be moved online, while other jobs such other like blue collar jobs that usually pay less, such as like for example working at like a restaurant and all that, like in-person jobs, like those ones cannot be moved online. So that's definitely been an issue.
Yeah, and it's one of my peers. I was actually discussing about this scenario with one of my peers, and they kind of posed me with an interesting question that I'd like to ask both of you. So let's say you have you know a single parent household, for example, um, and the school's closed down. So in this single income household, is the parent going to be able to afford someone to look after their child, since they won't be at school while they're off to work, or while they have to take off from work to look after their child? It seems like kind of a lose-lose situation. I want to know what you two think about that.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, another article I wrote for the Daily was about how people who work in laboratory sciences, and also female scientists, especially ones with children, like due to after the pandemic, they were found to kind of like have spent less time on their research. And I know some possible factors is because yeah, daycares are closed and they can't really get someone to hire they can't hire someone to take care of their children. And laboratory sciences like chemistry and biology, like they have to do it in person. So yeah, there's that too.
Given the numerous challenges posed by the pandemic, I really do hope that this situation will ameliorate very soon, especially in countries like the United States, where the coronavirus is still an extremely grave and serious issue. In my humble opinion, the pandemic, COVID-19, has been the worst thing to happen to human beings since probably World War II back in the 1940s. It's been something that's affected us so deeply, that's made us lose hundreds of thousands of lives. That's made us, I think it's even in the millions of lives, right? Into the millions of lives. Yeah. And so many people infected, affecting us for more than a year, when we thought at the very beginning, when the pandemic broke out in Wuhan, that it would last less than like 2 months. It's truly been a game changer in our lives. And it's truly been a terrible experience for everyone involved.
Yeah, an absolutely terrible experience. I agree. And it's also an evolving situation. We're kind of seeing things unfold in front of us. As we speak, there are, advancements. There are more people getting cases in certain places. There's a little bit of everything everywhere of how, in terms of how the situation is evolving. Um, I wanted to just say that our experiences and perspectives are limited, given that we're all from the same age group, political ideology, and we're all university students, and most of the people we interviewed are also university students. But I think we can. It's still fair to discuss kind of what we discussed in our perspectives and our peers' perspectives and interviewees' perspectives on how COVID and their experiences with COVID have affected their lives and their perspectives on the whole pandemic situation.
Definitely. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to our podcast.